Kundalini, Psychosis or Transcendence by Lee Sanella, MD, with a picture of the caduceus, the staff of Hermes, the Karikion, the Kundalini. Acknowledgements. This book is to a large extent the product of a group effort. In particular, the author and the publisher wish to thank Keith Borden, Frida Morris, Gabriel Cousins, Daniel Kintz, Jean Millay, Richard Lowenberg, Elaine Chernoff, Beverly Johnson, George Meek, James Fadiman, and Itzhak Bentov for their advice and assistance in preparing, editing, and reviewing the manuscript and artwork. Introduction. The significance of the rebirth process. The problem of objectivity. Kundalini as a model for the rebirth process. Cross-cultural aspects of Kundalini in Africa, in the Christian tradition, heat manifestations in different cultures, in the Orient, Ouroboros, an American case. Case histories of Kundalini experiences. Sudden Kundalini arising. Discussion. Summary of signs and symptoms, motor, sensory, interpretive, non-physiological. Correlation with Bentov's model. Concluding comment. Kundalini, classical and clinical. Diagnostic considerations. Recommendations and further discussion. Kundalini as therapy. Summary. Epilogue. Appendix A. Micromotion of the body as a factor in the development of the nervous system by Itzhak Bentov. Appendix B. Masts. The God-intoxicated ones. Appendix C. Sensitivity in the human organism. Appendix D. For physicians and neurologists. Appendix E. Questions for research participants. Introduction. Tissues are torn, blood vessels severed, blood spilled, much fluid is lost. The heart races and the blood pressure soars. There is moaning, crying and screaming. A severe injury? No, only a relatively normal human birth. The description sounds pathological because the symptoms were not understood in relation to the outcome, a new human being. In a darkened room, a man sits alone. His body is swept by muscular spasms. Indescribable sensations and sharp pains run from his feet up his legs and over his back and neck. His skull feels as if it will burst. Inside his head he hears roaring sounds and high-pitched whistling. Then suddenly a sunburst floods his inner being. His hands burn. He feels his body tearing within. Then he laughs and is overcome with bliss. A psychotic episode? No. This is a psychophysiological transformation. A rebirth process is natural as physical birth. It seems pathological only because the symptoms are not understood in relation to the outcome, an enlightened human being. When allowed to progress to completion, this process culminates in a deep psychological balance, strength, and maturity. Its initial stages, however, often share the violence, helplessness, and imbalance that attend the start of human infancy. For thousands of years, from the ancient Vedas onward, this process has been described. Until recently, it was confined to distant cultures, esoteric traditions, and a few isolated individuals. Accounts of it have usually been highly personal and often permeated with vague mysticism and strange mythology. As a result, the accounts were not taken seriously, and no systematic comparison of the reports from different traditions was possible. Also, many of these traditions claimed divine revelation and absolute truth. Consequently, professionals have remained confused, skeptical, and suspicious. Lately, two factors have changed this situation radically. First, there has been a marked increase in the number of people undergoing intense spiritual experiences within our own culture. Second, the influence of Western science has resulted in a new emphasis on describing the objective aspects of this process in other societies as well as our own. Consequently, it is now possible to compare the experiences of different traditions by a uniform set of standards and to apply those same standards in making first-hand clinical observations. We find a marked uniformity in the descriptions of this process from widely disparate traditions. Gopi Krishna, a yogi writer, says that from the recorded experience of the Christian mystics, Sufi masters, and yoga adepts, it is obvious that the basic essentials of the experience are the same. A study of these accounts, when enough detail is recorded, reveals symptom patterns and types of sensations that are similar to those found in our cases. We believe that these common aspects have physiological components and that the activation of a single physiological mechanism is at the root of the wide diversity of phenomena we see. If these assumptions are correct, the idea of spiritual rebirth or enlightenment can no longer be considered a confusing jumble of superstitious religious dogmas and wild rumors. Spiritual rebirth has become instead a well-defined entity. We may now ask, what is this process? To what state does it lead? Do these people really develop psychic powers? How does it differ from normality on the one hand and from psychosis on the other? Is it merely another one of the altered states of consciousness that many researchers are now exploring, or is it something more? It is not simply an altered state of consciousness, but an ongoing process lasting from several months to many years, during which the person passes in and out of different states of consciousness. The process falls outside the categories of both normal and psychotic, because a person undergoing the transformation has experiences far removed from normal, usually without becoming so disorganized as to be considered psychotic. Nor is the process simply one of becoming psychic, because persons who have not undergone the transformation may be psychic, while others who have completed it may not be. The transformation may lead to many special abilities, but it is not intrinsically tied to them. Tirtha points out that a great yogi who has control over his heart action may not have his Kundalini active, while one with an active Kundalini may have no such abilities. For the person undergoing the transformation, the significance of the enlightened state may be highly personal and subjective. Our aim, however, is to describe the process itself in terms of what can be observed. In this book, we present many cases, some from a survey of diverse cultures and spiritual traditions, and others from our own clinical experiences. These give us ample data for composing a portrait of the process. Ordinarily, a clinician may present his or her cases with the expectation that they will be accepted at face value, although the conclusions may be questioned. But in this area, we are forced to hesitate. Should we present data that appear impossible in the current models of Western science? Or should we refrain from publishing observations we believe to be accurate in order not to jeopardize acceptance of more vital issues? We feel that holding back data is evasive and in the long run destructive to the spirit of science. If today's models prove inadequate, it is because tomorrow's will be better. Not only the researcher and the writer, but also the reader must here make a special effort to be objective. We believe that the writers cited are reliable. Our own cases are all living, and except for one, are currently in touch with the author. With a few exceptions, they are willing to be interviewed by any serious investigator. Researchers wishing to confirm or extend our data can contact these people through the author. All of us owe them an immense debt of gratitude for their generous cooperation. From a survey of the literature, the clinical study of our own cases and laboratory findings, we present the thesis that a process most usefully viewed as the rise of the Kundalini is a reality, is much to be desired, and can be described as an evolutionary process taking place in the human nervous system. It is interesting to note that our thesis is consistent with the observations of Gopi Krishna. From his personal experience with the rising of his own Kundalini, he says, "A new center presently dormant in the average man and woman has to be activated, and a more powerful stream of psychic energy must rise into the head from the base of the spine to enable human consciousness to transcend the normal limits. This is the final phase of the present evolutionary impulse in man. The cerebrospinal system of man has to undergo a radical change, enabling consciousness to transcend the normal limits. This is the final phase of the present evolutionary impulse in man. The cerebrospinal system of man has to undergo a radical change, enabling consciousness to attain a dimension which transcends the limits of the highest intellect. Here reason yields to intuition, and revelation appears to guide the steps of humankind. The living substance which in an altered form is responsible for causing this aesthetic revolution in the brain is entirely beyond our scrutiny and will remain so for a long time to come. We shall begin our presentation by discussing the special significance of the rebirth process today and the problem of objectivity in the description of spiritual states. Then we shall present the Kundalini concept from yoga tradition as the classical rebirth model most widely applicable and most easily amenable to physiological interpretation. But certain differences between the classical Kundalini concept and our own cases will lead us to propose a variation, the physio-Kundalini model, to account for our observations. Our data consists of published reports from diverse cultures and many cases of our own. From these, we shall summarize the characteristic signs and symptoms of the rebirth process. Designating these the physio-Kundalini complex, we derived this concept from a model recently proposed by Itzhak Bentov to explain the effects of Kundalini. His is the first theory of the Kundalini phenomenon subject to experimental verification. The significance of Bentov's work will be discussed, and his paper is included here in the appendix. We consider how our findings relate to the classical yogic description of Kundalini action. Then in our discussion of diagnosis, we showed that it is possible to recognize the physio-Kundalini process and distinguish it from psychosis, even when these two conditions have temporarily merged in a particular individual. This distinction will help make it possible for clinicians to avoid the mistakes that have often been made in the past. People undergoing the rebirth process often need special help. We shall consider what forms of help are advisable and which are not. Finally, we shall suggest an approach for coping with the problems and opportunities generated by the rebirth phenomenon in society as a whole. Here we may be guided by the precedent of Meher Baba's work with masks, so a second appendix has been added on this subject. But why is rebirth possible at all? A third appendix, Sensitivity in the Human Organism, deals with this question. A fourth appendix is for the use of medical specialists, and the final appendix for clinicians. Study in this area is timely, indeed it is urgent. The new preoccupation with spiritual and occult practices, especially among the young, holds both great promise and great danger. It is essential that we quickly arrive at a deeper understanding of this field.